In antiquity, Jews, or Judeans, or Israelites, were a small but significant tribe in a strip of land at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. Somewhere around the year 1000 before the Common Era, a Jewish kingdom was established. A few decades later, it splintered into two competing kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judea in the south. After the Babylonian conquest in the 6th century before the Common Era, many Judeans and Israelites were forced into exile. But after 7 decades, many of the Judean exiles returned to the homeland. In the year 70 of the Common Era, Judea suffered a similar fate under Roman conquest. A small community remained in the land that the Romans now called Palestine, but many Jews were now refugees. Most of these refugees, scattered throughout Europe, northern Africa, and western Asia, held on to their religious and national identities as Jews or Judeans. Now skip ahead to the 19th century. In Europe, many ethnic groups were seeking recognition as national entities and were demanding independence from hegemonic superpowers. And some Jews were experiencing a similar pull of nationalism, a movement for recognition of Jewish nationhood, and for some, a return to the ancient homeland, the land of Zion. This movement, which became known as Zionism, was both political and cultural. It was a program to be a nation once again on its own land and have self-rule. It was also a program to reject the unnatural culture of the diaspora and create a new, healthier culture based on both ancient Israel and the contemporary Middle East. Now, Palestine had been under Ottoman or Turkish rule for many centuries until 1918. But after World War I, in 1920, the land became a British protectorate. The fledgling Jewish community in Palestine in the first half of the 20th century was dedicated to returning to the land as farmers and as builders. Inspired by their belief in equality and social justice, many established communal farming enclaves called kibbutzim. Solidarity and commitment to the communal enterprise were the highest priority, and group singing was seen as a significant bonding activity to reflect that shared commitment. Several sociologists, political scientists, and ethnomusicologists have commented on the power of music to create community. Professor Thomas Turino noted that participatory music is mostly about social synchrony, social relations being realized through performance. Furthermore, Professor Benedict Anderson wrote that singing together has the potential to create an imagined sense of shared national identity. Here are some voices from Jewish pioneers in Palestine in the first half of the 20th century. In 1938, an anonymous member wrote in a kibbutz publication, quote, "Singing is the refuge from daily toil. While singing, one reaches full unity with one's comrades." And writing in the newsletter of the Givat Brenner kibbutz, December 17, 1941, a man by the name of Shimon B. advocated the establishment of a chorus as a solution to the social problems of the kibbutz. He wrote, "So often have we heard our members complain about the tenuous social situation, but I think that there is a very simple cure for all such bitter pessimists, which is a chorus. I have attended the recent rehearsal of our chorus, and I was delighted. They all sang together. Here they are all really equal, members of one chorus. The melody, the harmony, the rhythmic sounds, the incredible effort to blend one's voice with all other voices, to create in both piano and forte a gentle and beautiful composition which is above the realm of daily good and bad. This is the primary factor in education for sociability." But while kibbutz and school choirs proliferated, choral singing in Israel remained, for the most part, an informal enterprise. But there were a few sporadic attempts to raise the artistic level. Here is a snapshot of one of the major figures in the attempt to raise the artistic level of choral singing. Shlomo Kaplan was one of the founders of choral music in the land of Israel. Beginning in 1929, Kaplan founded a number of choral organizations: the Petach Tikva Laborers Choir, the Maccabi Avshalom Choir, the choruses of the towns of Herzliya, Kfar Saba, Ra'anana, Magdiel, Kfar Malal, and the area's kibbutzim. These choruses later united and became the Sharon Choir, which included more than 300 singers. In 1942, Kaplan moved to Tel Aviv, where he conducted the opera choir, the Great Synagogue Choir, and the Tel Aviv Laborers Chorus, which he himself founded. In the early 1950s, Kaplan was appointed head of the music department of the Labor Federation, which was called the Histadrut. As part of this position, he was in charge of choral activity in Israel. He encouraged the training of choral conductors, and he advanced choir singing in all the collective agricultural labor settlements. Then, in the 1930s, the influx of German Jews fleeing the Nazi regime and settling mostly in the Tel Aviv area created an audience and provided performers for classical music. In 1941, Eitan Lustig founded the Tel Aviv Chamber Choir, which would eventually become the Tel Aviv Philharmonic Choir. After the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, population growth and urbanization led to a new level of choral activity. In 1952, Aaron Tzvi Propus inaugurated the Zimriya, the World Assembly of Choirs in Israel, a triennial international choral festival which today continues to provide opportunities for Israeli singers to work with their counterparts from around the world. Propus's aim was to put Israel on the international map of large-scale musical events on the highest possible level. The first serious and successful attempts at professionalizing choral singing came with the founding of two choruses, both in 1955. Gary Bertini founded the Rinat Choir, which 20 years later, in 1975, was named the National Choir of Israel. Also in 1955, Yehuda Sharet established the Ichud Israel Kibbutz Choir to provide performing opportunities for the most talented singers from kibbutzim throughout the land of Israel. Let's look at a few of the other prominent choirs in Israel as of this writing, the year 2020. The Jerusalem Academy Chamber Chorus, a professional ensemble conducted by Stanley Sperber. The Jerusalem Oratorio Choirs, conducted by Naama Nazarati Gordon. The Jerusalem A Cappella Singers, conducted by Judy Axelrod. The ensemble Gevatron, conducted by Ilan Gilboa, specializes in popular and folk music arrangements. The YMCA Jerusalem Youth Chorus, conducted by its founder, Micah Handler, brings together teenagers who are Jewish, who are Muslim, who are Christian, from both East and West Jerusalem to talk together and to sing together. And they have toured around the world. The Moran Children's Choirs, conducted by Naomi Farran. Another ensemble that brings together people from different communities is the Rana Choir of Jaffa, Arab and Jewish women, conducted by Mika Dani. The Naama Women's Choir, conducted by Penina Inbar. The ensemble Choral, conducted by its founder Tzvi Scherf, specializes in popular-sounding arrangements of popular songs and folk songs. And the Jerusalem Great Synagogue Choir, conducted by Eli Jaffe and Raymond Goldstein, who, incidentally, writes most of the arrangements for this choir. Many composers who immigrated to the land of Israel in the 1940s tried to turn their backs, at least in part, on musical developments in Europe. They also distanced themselves from the traditional European Jewish musical culture. Instead, they sought their inspiration in the melodies of the Middle East, ancient and modern. In the words of Israeli composer Ben-Zion Orgad, Western nations display in our era a kind of exhaustion. There is a difference between our exoticism and that of the West. Ours arises out of a desire to be absorbed into an old, new ethnic region. We have a strong desire to bridge our contemporary culture with our ancient culture. In conformity with pioneer ideals, these composers eschewed the avant-garde and endeavored to make their compositions readily accessible to both performers and audience. By the early 1940s, a new self-conscious nationalistic style had emerged, which was soon dubbed the Eastern Mediterranean School, marked by the assimilation of Middle Eastern folk elements into the framework of Western musical tradition. The term Eastern Mediterranean was coined in the 1940s by Israeli music critics who were alluding to an essay, The Case of Wagner, written by Friedrich Nietzsche in 1888. The essay compared the music of Bizet's Carmen with the operas of Wagner, on whom Nietzsche was now turning his back. Musicians in Israel eagerly adopted Nietzsche's description of Bizet's opera as their own musical credo. Here's what Nietzsche wrote. What Carmen has, above all else, is that which belongs to subtropical zones, that dryness of atmosphere, that limpidezza of the air. Here, in every respect, the climate is altered. Here, another kind of sensuality, another kind of sensitiveness, and another kind of cheerfulness make their appeal. This music is gay, but not in a French or German way. Its gaiety is African. I envy Bizet for having had the courage of this sensitiveness, which hitherto in the cultured music of Europe has found no means of expression. This southern, tawny, sunburnt sensitiveness. What a joy the golden afternoon of its happiness is to us. Il faut méditerraniser la musique. We must Mediterraneanize our music. And I have reasons for this principle. The return to nature, health, good spirits, youth, and virtue. In 1951, the critic Max Brod described the Eastern Mediterranean sound. He said, "It is southern, infused with the bright light of the Mediterranean air, lucid, striving for clarity. The rhythm includes obstinate repetition, but also manifold, ceaseless variation, which enchants by its apparent freedom from rule and impulsiveness. It is not polyphonically overburdened. The influence exerted by the melodies of the Yemenite Jews, the return to ancient modes, in all these respects, lines of connection can be drawn with Arabic music." Paul ben-Haim is considered the father of the Eastern Mediterranean school of composition. He was born July 1897 in Munich, Germany. His given name was Paul Frankenburger. Paul studied composition and conducting at the Munich Music Academy, and then served as conductor in Munich and Augsburg and in Marino, Italy. After the Nazis came to power in 1933, Paul left Germany for good. He moved to Tel Aviv, changed his name to ben-Haim, and changed his compositional style to reflect his new surroundings. Here is how Paul ben-Haim described his compositional credo. He wrote, "I am of the West by birth and education, but I stem from the East, and now I live in the East. I regard this as a great blessing indeed, and it makes me feel grateful. The problem of synthesis of East and West occupies musicians all over the world. If we, thanks to our living in a country that forms a bridge between East and West, if we can provide a modest contribution to such a synthesis in music, we shall be very happy." For textual inspiration, for lyrics, these composers often turned to the Bible. Certain biblical verses represented, for the modern Jewish settlers, a historical link with the ancient Hebrew kingdom. Songs of praise from the Psalms, songs of love from Solomon's Canticle, songs from the Pentateuch describing Israel's earliest connection with the land, and verses from the prophets predicting their nation's eventual restoration to that land. But despite the prevalence of biblical texts, most of these choral works were intended for concert performance. They were in no sense liturgical. What are the characteristics of the Eastern Mediterranean soundscape that these composers sought to incorporate? First, let's examine the scales. The folk music of the Middle East is characterized by scales whose interval patterns are, in many cases, different from those of Western Europe. These include ditonic or two-note, tritonic or three-note, and pentatonic, five-note scales, modes which resemble the ecclesiastical scales, such as the Dorian, the Aeolian, the Phrygian, and Mixolydian. As well as chromatic scales of various configurations. Texture. The texture of heterophony. Composers of the Eastern Mediterranean school experimented with textures that characterized the local Arabic music. Heterophony is the simultaneous appearance of a melody in two or more voice parts, where one will deliver the melody in a simple form and the others in a variant form. Another texture is parallel fourths and fifths. In parallel part singing, octaves, fifths, fourths, thirds, and even seconds are widespread. Composers often scored voices in parallel fourths or fifths. Drones of various types are common to these folk styles. In its simplest form, the drone is an accompaniment consisting of a single pitch, either sustained indefinitely or broken up into repeated iterations. As to the rhythm, some composers attempted to capture the rhapsodic freedom of chant or of the Arabic taqsim. The meter of Middle Eastern music is in many cases additive or heterometric, constructed of a chain of short, dissimilar metric units. So it's not unusual to encounter such meters as 1 2 3 1 2, 1 2 3 1 2, or 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2, 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2, or 1 2 3 1 2 1 2, 1 2 3 1 2 1 2, or 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3. Another phenomenon that characterizes the Israeli Mediterranean school is the evocation of the hora dance rhythm, its characteristic syncopation, bum 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 bum, was adopted by many of the composers of this school. In 1956-57, Paul ben-Haim composed Roni Akara, a secular four-movement motet which he dedicated to the Rinat choir. For lyrics, ben-Haim chose verses from the biblical prophet Isaiah, from chapter 54, verses 1 through 5. The theme of this text is the revival of Israel and restoration on its land, the end to suffering, and the eventual triumph of the underdog. In the first movement, we see how symbolically the rejected wife, who has not borne children, now will be fruitful. Isaiah's words, "Sing joyfully, O barren one, you who bore no child. Break forth into joyous song, you who did not labor. For the children of the desolate wife shall outnumber those of the married wife. The Lord has spoken." The second movement focuses on the prophecy of the expansion of the small tribe. Isaiah's words, "Enlarge the site of your tent, extend the size of your dwelling, do not stint, lengthen the ropes, and drive the pegs firm." The third movement at first continues the theme of the expansion of the tribe. Isaiah's words, "For you shall expand to the right and to the left. Your offspring shall dispossess nations, and shall people the desolate towns." And then the text turns back to the idea from the first movement, the rejected woman who is now pardoned and restored. Isaiah's words, "Fear not, you shall not be ashamed. Do not cringe, you shall not be disgraced. For you shall forget the reproach of your youth and remember no more the shame of your widowhood." And finally, in the fourth movement, we see the rejected, desolate woman, the widow, now redeemed in marriage by none less than the Lord of the world. In the words of Isaiah, "For he who made you will espouse you. His name is Lord of hosts. The Holy One of Israel will redeem you. He is called God of all the earth." In the first movement, right away, we hear the hora rhythm. The texture is, for the most part, just two parts, with the sopranos and tenors in octaves, and the basses and altos in octaves. The mode might be thought of as hypodorian on D. And the overall form of the movement is A-B-A. Throughout the piece, we notice the general avoidance of dominant Teutonic cadences. The final cadence of this movement is E minor 7 to A major. The second movement features a passacaglia, a six-measure repeated theme in the bass. As you could hear, that opening melody sounds pentatonic, with D as a tonal center. As the movement progresses, the voices gradually pile up one on top of the other, and the four voice parts seem to be independent of one another, both modally and metrically. And the effect is a slow crescendo from the beginning of the movement to the end of the movement. And here is the final cadence of the second movement. Over an E pedal, we hear a D7-9 chord resolving to E major. The third movement is characterized by a mixed meter to accommodate an irregular, fragmented melody. It has that characteristic rhythm of an eighth rest or an eighth note, followed by two 16th notes, followed by an eighth note. The mode seems to be Phrygian, first on E, and then on A. There are several ostinati and drones. Look at the bass part at measure 9. At measure 27, on top of this vibrant texture, is layered a legato melody. In kind of an unusual pairing, the alto section with a baritone soloist an octave lower. The final cadence of this movement is a D minor 7/9 chord to A major. The fourth movement begins with an unmetered recitative for solo voices. We can see the antiphonal relationship between the alto soloist and the other soloists, at first the baritone and bass. We also hear the chromatic scales, some of which feature alternating whole and half steps, what we would call octatonic. The movement also features characteristic ornaments, such as the turn in the bass part in measure 3. And listen to the parallel fourths in measure 2. At measure 9, we hear a recapitulation of the opening of the first movement, but in a different kind of treatment. At first, it's antiphonal between the soprano and the other three voices, first as a solo quartet and then with tutti, and there from the end grows in dynamics and increases in a faster and faster tempo. At measure 35, we hear another gentle treatment of the opening theme from the first movement, this time in strettos, soprano, alto, and tenor. Notice on the final cadence, first of all, there's the descending bass with a sustained note in the soprano part. Giving us the final cadence chords of G9, F, E minor 7 with an added 11th, and finally A major with an added 6th. Now, this podcast has attempted to describe one body of choral music, the Eastern Mediterranean style, showing some of the historical reasons for its emergence at a particular time in history, searching its roots and dissecting its characteristics. But composers in Israel represent many bands of the musical spectrum: nationalist and internationalist, aleatoric, dodecaphonic, neo-romantic, minimalist, electronic, concrète, progressive, and traditionalist. Let's just have a look at some of the other noted Israeli composers of choral music, starting with Chaim Alexander, Tzvi Avni, another look at Paul ben-Haim, Yechezkel Brown, Dov Carmel, Tzipi Fleischer, Akram Haddad is a young Arab Israeli composer who has written some beautiful settings, including the one you see on this page, a setting of Psalm 121 in Arabic. Andrei Haidu, Aaron Harlap, Mark Lavry, Erden Partosh, Shulamit Ran, Moshe Rasyuk, Mordechai Seter, Max Stern, Menachem Wiesenberg, Moshe Wilensky, More information on these composers can be found in the Composers section of www.jewishchoralmusic.com. Other resources available are the Israel Music Institute, the major publisher of Israeli music, the Israeli Composers League, the Israeli Choral Association, called Hallel, and the Zimriah, the World Assembly of Choirs in Israel. Songwriters in the early years of the Jewish settlement in Israel created a body of popular song to serve the needs of the national enterprise. Composed for communal singing, these were thought of as folk songs. The lyrics emphasized the historical and intimate connection to the land, farming and construction, military defense, rejoicing, and the importance of group solidarity. Often modes were used rather than standard European scales. To make them easy to sing, the range was usually no more than 1 octave. The form was strophic, and there was abundant repetition of phrases. Most people were unaware of the provenance of these songs. They were considered folk songs, not songs of a person, but songs of a people. And many choruses, both in Israel and in the diaspora, were eager to perform these songs in choral arrangements. One of the earliest and best-known popular songs from the land of Israel is Hava Nagila. It was written around the year 1917. The musicologist Abraham Tzvi Edelson adapted a wordless Hasidic nigun, a devotional song, and added lyrics derived from Psalm 118, but adding a liberal secular twist. The lyrics translate as, "Let's be joyous and be happy. Let's sing a joyous song and be happy. Arise, brothers or comrades, arise with happy hearts." We will hear an arrangement created in 1914 D9 by the young composer-conductor Daniel Factori. Israeli society is largely secular. Those who do consider themselves religious or orthodox prefer a liturgical service that is traditional, monophonic, and unadorned with musical instruments or choral singing. Exceptions are to be found in the so-called Great Synagogues, primarily in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. A professional cantor is supported by an all-male, professional, unaccompanied choir. The focus is on the cantor. The choir's role is primarily to support him. In recent years, interest has also grown for concerts of cantorial and choral music. Such concerts are attended by secular as well as religious Israelis, and since they are given outside of the liturgical context, they may include instrumental accompaniment. Some synagogues and other institutions in America have commissioned Israeli composers to write liturgical settings that feature a mixed choir and instrumental accompaniment. These are rarely performed in Israel. We will listen to the last movement of Paul ben-Haim's Kabbalat Shabbat, a setting of the Friday evening liturgy commissioned in 1967 by the National Federation of Temple Youth. The Adon Olam is based on this old Sephardic folk song. Here is a setting of Psalm 113 from Hallel by Yechezkel Brown, commissioned in 1984 by Congregation Adath Jeshurun in Minneapolis. In Chapter 9, we will investigate the Jewish aspect of choirs, composers, and choral music of the 20th and 21st centuries, sacred and secular, primarily in the United States.